Hi, this is Chris Young, and welcome to episode 34 of Contemplating Life. I always hated history class in school, which is strange because, as a topic, I really enjoy history. The history classes in school test you on what I believe are inconsequential aspects of history. Things like the date something occurred, or even its exact location, are often not important. I'm more interested in the cause and consequence of a historical event. I have a kind of Heisenberg uncertainty principle when it comes to history. I can tell you when the War of 1812 was, but I don't know where it was fought. Or I know where the Treaty of Versailles was signed, but I don't remember the date. Okay, bad joke. But seriously, for me, the details are not as important as the context. History classes expect rote memorization of facts and don't always seem to care much about context as I wish they did. I've always believed in the adage, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Apparently, it was originated by Spanish philosopher George Santayana, but most remember it from a speech given by Winston Churchill in 1948. Regardless of its origin, I've always heeded its warning and studied history for that reason. Last week, I discussed several major historical events that I've lived through because I think reflecting on history is an important way of contemplating life. As regular listeners know, I'm a huge fan of science fiction and an aspiring science fiction writer. One of the most popular subgenres of science fiction is the time travel story. Typically, someone invents a time machine and wants to travel to the past or the future out of curiosity. Most time travel stories involve someone who wants to change the past. They want to rewrite history and fix whatever's wrong with it. For this episode and the next one, I want to talk about what I would change in history during my lifetime if I could, and speculate how I might do it. It's a bit of fantasy I've engaged in over the years on sleepless nights. I hope that someday I might be able to turn this mental exercise into a sci-fi novel. Spoiler, it isn't going to work. But I want to tell you about it anyway, and about why it won't work. When contemplating my own life and attempting to learn from my own history, I think it might be useful to consider what I might have done differently if I had the opportunity to do things over again. How could I avoid the mistakes of the past? What have I done wrong that needs to be set right? After careful consideration, I came to the amazing conclusion that I probably wouldn't change very much. Oh, certainly there's mistakes I made that I would fix if I could. I've hurt people's feelings. Sometimes I'm ashamed to admit I betrayed their trust or neglected to appreciate the people in my life. We've already discussed some of those things in previous episodes. But when it comes to major life choices, I couldn't think of anything I would do differently. I don't regret leaving the church in my late teens. I don't regret coming back in my late 20s. I don't regret my choice of college major or career. I might have started pursuing fiction writing earlier, rather than waiting until I was in my 60s. But other than that, when it comes to life choices, there isn't much I would change. The only marginally big decision I would make differently is I probably would not have joined a fraternity in college. The fraternity was Alpha Phi Omega. It wasn't your typical social fraternity. It was more of a service organization, and it was founded on the principles of the Boy Scouts of America. It's not that I regret joining the organization. I have mostly fond memories of membership. But in the balance of things, I don't think I got as much out of it as I put into it. I didn't develop any lasting friendships from being a member. It just wasn't rewarding enough to take up as much of my life as I devoted to it. No regrets per se, but It just wasn't that special. Naturally, the biggest challenge of my life has been my lifelong disability. It's been irresistible to speculate what my life might have been like had I not had spinal muscular atrophy. Note in episode 2, I argued you can't do that. You can't separate me from my disability, especially because it's genetic. If I didn't have SMA, I would be a totally different person. In August 2020, I decided to try my hand at writing science fiction. I was going to write a collection of stories titled, You Can't Do That, but What If You Could? The tagline would be Dreams, Fantasies, and the Stories Behind Them. One of the stories I wanted to write was a fantasy about what it would be like if I could live my life over again without my disability. That would fit in the title, You Can't Do That, but What If You Could? As I mentioned in episode 3, many people would think that it's ableist to fantasize about what your life might have been without a disability. I've already given my reasons why I don't agree with that. So the scenario I set up was a guy named Eric, who's essentially me. He has SMA just like me. His life is very much like me. He's on his deathbed, on a ventilator, in a coma. He hears a disembodied voice who offers him the opportunity to live his life over again, with two unique features. First of all, he would not have SMA or any other disability. And second, he would retain all of the memories and intellect that he had accumulated in his first lifetime. In the story, Eric's consciousness would be transported back in time to the day of his birth and would be implanted in him as a newborn baby. He would only have the physical abilities of an infant his age, so he wouldn't be able to talk immediately or have physical control over his body. But obviously, he would acquire these skills much more rapidly than a child going through normal development. One of the first questions would be, how much of that secret ability should I reveal? I concluded he would want to be as normal as possible with this chance to live his life over, so he would probably not reveal much of any of his secret abilities or knowledge. This started out as an exploration of what it would be like for a disabled person to relive their life without a disability. I don't think I would have argued that his life was better with the disability, but I think the story would have concluded that he was no more or less happy or fulfilled without the disability than he was with it. But then I realized this is essentially a time travel story. There would be things you could do to exploit the magical circumstance. You might invest in Apple and Microsoft on day one. You'd bet on the Super Bowl, assuming you can remember who won each year. I'd be putting big money on the Jets over the Colts in 1969. Nobody saw that one coming. I became obsessed with exploring what one could do under such circumstances, regardless of the idea that it got rid of your disability. I could even tell the story about a non-disabled character just as easily, and it would be a pretty good story. While it's obvious that my personal history would be vastly different from the original timeline, could I change major historical events? How might I become rich, famous, or powerful? Assume I do so for altruistic purposes. I want to make the world a better place. I want to take advantage of the gift of a mulligan. Suppose I can change history. That ruins my ability to know the future, because history would unfold much differently than the history I lived through the first time. That means if I'm going to make a major change, I only get one shot at it. What big event in my lifetime would I change to make the world a better place? Well, in 1963, I was 8 years old. Could I save JFK? If an 8-year-old kid calls the FBI and says that President Kennedy is going to be killed in Dallas, no one's going to believe him. Kennedy ends up dying anyway. And then they come back to me and want to know how I knew. They put me in a lab and study me for the rest of my life. I think I'll pass on that option. Besides, Stephen King already explored saving Kennedy in the TV series 11/22/63. Could I stop the Vietnam War? Well, Daniel Ellsberg tried and couldn't. I don't think leaking the Pentagon Papers earlier would have had any impact. Could I have stopped Richard Nixon? Well, as traumatic as Watergate was for the country, in the end, justice was mostly served. Nixon left office in disgrace and never influenced public policy again, nor did he ever redeem his reputation. I was certainly no fan of Ronald Reagan. John Hinckley hated Reagan and had an abnormal crush on Jodie Foster. I could identify with both of those things. The thing that made Hinckley insane, and not me, is Hinckley somehow thought those two things were connected. I couldn't make that connection. Anyway, as much as I disliked Ronald Reagan and had a crush on Jodie Foster, I never wished him any ill will. Love him or hate him, Reagan's massive military spending contributed to the downfall of the Soviet Union and brought down the Berlin Wall. So maybe Reagan gets a pass. Several years ago, when I was thinking about this story, the biggest world health crisis of my lifetime was HIV/AIDS. Well, I might have been able to do something to call attention to it sooner. I lacked the technical skills to really do anything about it. A few years ago, as I was pondering these issues, the biggest threat to democracy, in my humble opinion, was 9/11 and the aftermath. By aftermath, I mean things like fighting an unnecessary war over WMD that didn't exist, Dick Cheney, Halliburton, and the no-bid contracts to rebuild Iraq, the Patriot Act, enhanced interrogation, which is just a fancy word for illegal torture, holding prisoners at Guantanamo without any legal representation and against international treaties, and other nasty things that proceeded from the post-9/11 era. So, I would prevent 9/11, keep incompetent Bush 43 and evil Cheney out of the White House, put in a strong progressive administration, and fix what's wrong with the world. You know, typical liberal agenda stuff. Sounds like fun, doesn't it? How do we do that? Well, the best way to influence policy and get the ear of the powers that be is to be filthy rich. Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and Elon Musk came along too late, so I can't steal their legacy. Besides, I don't know anything about running an internet marketing company, social media, building electric vehicles, or rockets. But I do know personal computers. I need to become Bill Gates. I need to be Gates before Gates becomes Gates. I need to out-Gates Gates. It turns out, even though this is a wild-ass fantasy, I seriously think I could do it if I could go back in time. I know what he did right, and I could duplicate it. I know what he did wrong, and I could learn from those mistakes. Microsoft was founded by Bill Gates and Paul Allen in April 1975. I was a sophomore computer science student at IUPUI at the time. Gates' first product was a basic language interpreter for the Altair personal computer. He didn't have one of those computers at the time, but he had access to the university PDP-10 computer, and he had an ASR 33 teletype machine with a paper tape punch on the side. He had written an 8008 microprocessor emulator, which ran on the PDP-10, and he used it to develop the program. He punched it onto paper tape and delivered it to MIT's computers, who produced the Altair. In 1975, I had access to a PDP-10 computer and an ASR-33 teletype machine with a paper tape punch on the side. It would have been a challenge, but I have no doubts that my friend Dennis and I could have duplicated what Gates and Allen did if we had had the insight to do so. Just because we wrote a basic interpreter that Gates wrote doesn't mean we could have duplicated the success of Microsoft. If we missed the opportunity to write that program, there was another nexus point in history where Gates was vulnerable. Microsoft's next big product was MS-DOS. Gates heard that IBM was entering the personal computer market with a new 16-bit computer. They were going to need a disk operating system for that machine. According to legend, Gates turns to Allen and says, "Do you know anything about writing an operating system?" "I don't." Neither one of them did. But they heard about a company called Seattle Computer Products, right up the road from Redmond, Washington. Seattle Computer Products made circuit boards for the popular S100 bus architecture computers. They made really great products. I had two of their memory boards in my first personal computer. They had introduced a 16-bit processor board, but they knew that their customers would need an operating system that would run on it. The market leader in 8-bit operating systems was a program called CP/M from a company known as Digital Research, founded by Gary Kildall. His 16-bit operating system, which would be known as CP/M-86, wasn't quite ready yet. So a developer named Timothy Patterson at Seattle Computer Products wrote a clone of CP/M that would run on 16-bit processors. He called it QDOS, which stood for Quick and Dirty Operating System. Gates and Allen traveled to Seattle and purchased the source codes and rights to QDOS for just $50,000. They made some minor modifications and put in a bid to license it to IBM for the new IBM PC. Kildall also tried to get IBM to license CP/M-86, but he was a very arrogant man who thought that IBM could never succeed in the PC market without him. He made ridiculous demands. Gates had only one condition. He would license his slightly revised QDOS to IBM under the brand name PC-DOS, but he would retain the rights to sell that same operating system to other manufacturers under the name MS-DOS. Well, IBM told Kildall to fuck off, and they signed with Gates. By the way, when Patterson found out what Microsoft was going to do with his QDOS that he had sold for a relatively small amount of money, he sued and reached a nice settlement. IBM suffered from arrogance of its own. It was so certain that it would dominate the market. It didn't anticipate that customers would rather have a cheap IBM clone running MS-DOS than to pay for a brand name like IBM. Inexpensive clones from companies like Gateway and later Dell dominated the market, and Microsoft became dominant in the personal computer software business. Microsoft was a bit shocked when Apple came along with the Macintosh computer and its graphical interface. They responded a little late with Windows. The first two iterations of Windows were pretty much useless, but eventually Windows came to dominate the market, and the rest is history. Gates is currently the fourth richest person in the world. If I operated a software company at the time, I could have entered the bidding war for the IBM operating system. I know how I would outdo both Gates and Kildall. In a single word, drivers. An operating system is supposed to isolate the application program from the hardware it's running on. If you're a word processor or a spreadsheet or a database, you shouldn't have to worry about the size of the screen, the type of the printer, or other hardware details. But both CP/M and MS-DOS, which was based on CP/M, only slightly abstracted the hardware interface. All they had was the ability to read and write data to a disk, read characters from the keyboard, write characters to the screen, and write characters to a printer port. So if you were writing a word processor, you had to develop your own special code to handle every brand and model of printer on the market. Under CP/M and MS-DOS, the driver for those printers was built into your application program, not the operating system where it really belonged. So your word processor might support your printer, but maybe your spreadsheet didn't. In contrast, drivers are now loaded into Windows. Application programs talk to Windows, and Windows handles the hardware-specific features for your brand of device. I think I could have written an 8-bit operating system to compete with CP/M that would have introduced advanced features that were not found at the time. Things like drivers, long file names, and file folders. There were two varieties of 8-bit processors used in those machines: the Intel 8080 and the Zilog Z80. The Z80 was cheaper, faster, and completely backward compatible with the 8080. Anything that would run on an 8080 would run on a Z80. However, the Z80 had additional features unavailable on the 8080. The massive numbers of computers, such as those made by Radio Shack, used the advanced Z80 processors, but they were still running software meant to work on the less capable 8080 chip. The software was not taking advantage of the advanced Z80 features. I think I could have written something that I would have called ZDOS, a Z80-specific operating system that would include advanced features like long file names, hierarchical file folders, timestamps on files, all of which were not introduced until later versions of MS-DOS. And I could have programmed drivers in a way that was not available until the introduction of Windows. I probably could not have dethroned CP/M, but I could have gotten my foot in the door at IBM and possibly beat Gates and Kildall both, because I would have already developed an operating system with features not present in MS-DOS or CP/M 86. Now, the old adage says, it takes money to make money. Kickstarting such an endeavor to develop that operating system would have taken a lot of startup money. I needed to get a little bit rich before I could get very rich. What could I do, perhaps as a teenager, that would leverage my knowledge of the future and make me a few $100,000 or maybe $1 million before I ever started in the computer business? After many sleepless nights, the answer came to me, and it was relatively simple. Before I could out Gates, I had to out Rubik. Hungarian professor of design Erno Rubik invented his famous puzzle in 1974. I was 19 years old at the time. Now, I've taken apart a Rubik's Cube. I know how the pieces fit together. And if I had good use of my hands, I could probably build one from scratch, even without a 3D printer, which wouldn't be invented for many years. I could probably carve one out of hardwood, or perhaps I could make the pieces out of clay, and then use that to make a silicone mold that I could fill with resin. My grandmother knew a well-to-do family who probably could have loaned me a couple of $1,000s to hire a patent attorney. In real life, when the matriarch of that family died, I inherited $5,000 that I put into my own computer business. So I think they would have been open to helping me. I would have called it the Twisty Cube, because Young's Cube just isn't as mysterious or exotic as a Rubik's Cube. I would have licensed it to Mattel or Whammo and made a fortune. Meanwhile, Erno Rubik and Bill Gates would be sitting around Budapest, Hungary, and Redmond, Washington, respectively, saying to themselves, "Gee, wish I'd thought of that." So in my little fantasy, which might someday become a sci-fi novel, now that I figured out how to become a millionaire by 17 and a billionaire by 30, I've decided that we need to cure AIDS, stop 9/11, install politicians with a solid liberal progressive agenda. But how do I do that? Well, tune in next week for the rest of the story of how I would change history if I could live my life over again. If you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 per month. You'll get early access to the podcast and any other benefits I might come up with down the road. And by the way, I've got a Patreon benefit coming really soon. More on that later. Although I have some financial struggles, I'm not really in this for the money. Still, every little bit helps. Many thanks to my Patreon supporters. Your support pays for the writing seminar I attend. But mostly I appreciate it because it shows how much you care and appreciate what I'm doing. Your support means way more to me than I can ever express. Even if you cannot provide financial support, please post links and share this podcast on social media so I can grow my audience. All of my back episodes are available, and I encourage you to check them out if you're new to the podcasts. If you have any comments, questions, or other feedback, please feel free to comment on any of the platforms where you find the podcasts. Share with me the stories of the historical events you've lived through. Let's get a conversation going. How would you change your life if you could do it over again? I'll see you next week as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe, everyone.